The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. You've probably heard that before. It is the start of chapter 1 of the Communist manifesto. But what does it mean? What is a class struggle and why would it be affecting all human society so far? And why use a word as complicated as hitherto in a manifesto for the whole world? Great questions, time to answer most of them. If you like this video or are interested in political and historical topics from a leftist point of view, you should subscribe, because I do that once a week. And if you're really interested, there's a Patreon page that lets you join my Discord server. Anyways, throughout history, many people found things they called a class war and wrote about them. In this video, since I'm an evil commie, I will only look at the Marxian concept of class warfare. Now, you wonder what Marxists mean by class. Nowadays, if we divide people up into classes, it's usually 3: upper class, middle class and lower class, based on wealth. This is not how Marxism defines it. Marx did not care about how wealthy you are, but how you relate to the economy. Picking the 21st century, Marx would have made a distinction between employees and employers. The employer owns the factory. They can hire and fire people at will, while the employees just have to take it. So in Marxism, if you're a multi-millionaire, if you work for someone else, like a producer, you are in the same class as factory workers. And if you have your own shop where you sell things with 2 employees, you're the same class as Jeff Bezos. It really depends on whether you own your workplace, aka your relation to the economy and the machines that run the economy. And if we look into the past, there were more classes than the ones we have now. The past economy was so different, it would not make sense to use our modern conception of workers and bosses to explain it. Historical production modes, which were also based on class, had more classes. Marx is using dialectics. This means he seeks irreconcilable conflicts between classes, usually 2 classes. For example, if you are a worker, then you want high pay and few hours, and your employer wants the opposite. That's an irreconcilable conflict. Only one of you can get what they want. And eventually, according to Marx, this conflict will lead to destruction of one of these classes, which makes a new economic system which eventually creates its own classes and conflict. So, class conflict is seen as inevitable under any previous system. That was all very abstract, so let's get concrete and explain these class struggles of all hitherto existing societies. Here is a question for you. What was the very first economic system? Depends on your definition, of course. According to Marx, economic production is the process of making, collecting or trading things that fulfill a human need, like food. Using this definition, we can say that the very first form of production was life as hunter-gatherers. People would hunt, people would gather, and they would live in tribes of about 100 people, which usually shared all that they had. So, where is the conflict here? Well, there was none. This form of production had no 2 classes and thus nobody to fight. Of course, tribal warfare was a thing, but in relation to the process of hunting and gathering, there were no classes. This is why Marx called this phase primitive communism. To a Marxist at the time, communism meant a society in which everyone is equal, everyone works as much as they can and take as much as they need. This is fitting because it actually describes how many tribes worked. We know that they took care of their sick, wounded and old, and they didn't even need to levy taxes to finance it. So, what happened to primitive communism? Why don't things work like that anymore? How did we move away from it? Technology. In the past, almost the whole workforce was busy hunting and gathering, but then a significant development occurred: agriculture. Suddenly, people could plant food and collect it without running around. And on top of that, farming really only has a few weeks of work in a year, once when planting and once when harvesting. In between that, you have time to invent civilization, writing, and large-scale armies. These early civilizations brought with them kings. Who was a king? Well, the ones with the most fields and or the biggest army. And they waged war with those who did not practice agriculture to conquer them and use them for work. The Roman Empire famously conquered tribes all over and enslaved their people. And who got the slaves? The wealthy farm owners. And this sparked a new conflict in this new system based on slavery. When farming was new, most common people owned land to farm. But as the conquests of the Roman Republic brought more and more slaves, these small farms were outcompeted by huge rich plantations worked by slaves. This formed three classes: the incredibly rich patricians, who owned all of the economic production and de facto ruled the state, and the poor, impoverished, and often unemployed plebeians. And of course the completely rightless slaves. The Roman Republic and Empire would for centuries suffer as it tried to balance the interests of the many and the few. Eventually the patricians got more and more economic power until they abolished all democratic measures and just declared themselves rulers, aka emperors. This led to corruption increasing over the decades, which ultimately made Rome unable to defend itself against invaders. It ended up destroying Rome and many of its wealthy people. After the collapse, the plebeians had won. They took the lands of the rich and set up their own communities and farms. Many of them were Germanics or Gothics. With the spread of Christianity through Europe, slavery was prohibited, for Christians at least, ending the period of that system. Of course, it has to be noted that it was not just the Romans who used slaves. More societies at the time did it than not. Of course, there were societies without slavery at the time, but the predominant mode of production at this time was slavery and economic oligarchy. After the collapse of Rome and its ruling class, you may think that everyone was way better off now that they could have their own farms, but they were not. Life expectancy dropped rapidly. Most advances of the Roman times and most of the specialized economy collapsed, and on top of that there were bandits trying to take everyone's stuff. This is why some people call this era between 500 and 700 AD the Dark Age. While people quickly adapted to having way worse lives than those under Rome had, one thing they could not adapt to was the constant raiding of their villages. After decades of this happening, a new system was established. Of course, even after Rome collapsed, there were still kings who conquered each other and such. So now you had these kings claiming the divine right of kings. And if you remember, slavery was outlawed by Christians. Kinda. This led to a problem, because a king can say they own X land, but if the people won't listen, that is sort of pointless. Of course, kings could terrorize the people and villages, but that would often just start peasants' uprisings. So the kings came up with a new idea. He would make villages an offer. Listen to the king and pay taxes, and in return the king will protect them from the raiders. This was a pretty sweet deal to the villages, because they had been raided for decades by this point. The villages would pay taxes to the king and provide men for the king's army, and in return they would be defended by the king if needed. So slowly all villages and towns joined this system, just for protection. At first this protection was done by literal soldiers from the army, but over time a separate class developed. It was mostly made up of the children of nobles who were not inheriting anything. So if a count had 5 children and only one could inherit, then the rest would be trained in fighting and sent to secure the king's peace. This class was known as knights. After knights started to be a thing, they were used to make sure that the villages that joined the kingdom would not change their minds or, God forbid, rebel. You see, the longer this system was around, the more taxes and burdens the villages had to endure. Sometimes taxes so high that they could barely eat. And on top of that, all the lower nobles took all the farmland for themselves, leaving the poor people, now called peasants, without anything to live on. But Since the landlords could not work the huge fields on their own, they made the peasants do it and pay most of the things they produced as a tax for working on the landowners' fields. And this is why they needed knights, to keep the peasants down. It was an awful system for them. There was one more class, was the clergy, the priests who served God and such. For this, they would levy taxes on the peasants as well. So the system that replaced the Roman system was medieval feudalism. There were 4 classes: the nobles, who owned almost everything, the clergy, who owned the rest, the knights, who kept the peasants down, and the peasants, who made up 95% of the population and were kept down and exploited. Curiously, when seen in relation to the production in society, clergy and nobility are almost the same. They do not work, but they do own land, and they tax the peasants and get defended by the knights. And they have the same interests. They want peasants to work long and hard so they can get more money without working. At the other end of the conflict, you have the peasants who want to work less and not get taxed. Feudalism was a horrible system for everyone but the top few percent. But the feudal contract allowed kings to crush rebellions and defend themselves against raiders. So it was a stable system for centuries. As time went on, there was a new class developing. They were not peasants working on land, and they were not landlords owning land. Instead, they were shop owners, traders, and small-scale manufacturers. They were united into guilds by the nobles for the sake of control. Naturally, these people had to fit in with the existing feudal order, so they needed to pay taxes to the lords and ladies, oftentimes even higher taxes than the peasants. In my last video I talked about the development of liberalism, so if I started talking about the French Revolution again, everyone would be bored. So, since capitalism was established in many places at many times, let's look at the way feudalism was replaced in England during the English Civil War. Essentially, England had a parliament since the days of William the Conqueror in the year 1066. As the guilds became more popular and powerful, they were angry. You see, the parliament was made up of 2 parts, the upper and the lower house. The upper house was all feudal nobles of the land, and the lower house was basically everyone else. But unlike in France, it was not that the peasants tried to overthrow the nobles. Instead, the entire parliament was angry with the king. They thought he had too much power and acted too much like an authoritarian. So the parliament and king fought over who could issue taxes, make laws, own property, and so on. In the end, there were 3 civil wars ending with the king being executed, the people winning new rights, and the monarchy returning a decade later. So that may have seemed pointless to many of you, but during the chaos of the Civil War, a lot of people seized the land of different nobles, usually the ones on the other side of the war, and the people divided it up amongst themselves. So even when the king returned, now a large amount of the land in the kingdom was in the hands of private individuals rather than nobles. As you know, capitalism is a system in which everyone can own property and one of free trade. After another 30 years, there was the Glorious Revolution, which saw a Dutch guy take over the government of England peacefully. This monarch cemented the rights of the parliament and the right of everyone to privately own land. So now they had capitalism, right? Well, not entirely. In the case of the French Revolution, there was a specific event at which all the nobles were disowned and the people took over via private ownership. But in England, this whole process took literal centuries. Just because private ownership was established did not mean that the nobles had no more power. They were allowed to keep all of their land, and even their noble titles, though often these had no more power behind them and were just for show. In the process of the East India Company being very rich, the ideas of free trade and stock trading became really popular. Then other events like the French Revolution, Napoleon's conquests of Europe, and the American War for Independence established capitalism in most of the world, ending feudalism. Of course, there are kings and queens around today, but production nowadays relies on private property, not feudal contracts. As I explained in my last video, Free market capitalism worked well initially, when everyone was working on farms or in small workshops. But with time, questions arose, like this one. Who do you think can make more textiles? A single manufacturer working by hand, or an orphan child working on huge industrial machinery for 18 hours a day? It's the orphan child. But that child has an issue. See, they can't afford the machinery. But the one who can is the person who runs the textile mill. Where did they get the money? Well, maybe they were one of these feudal landlords. Maybe they were one of the people who owned a larger workshop. Either way, they owned capital, making them a capitalist. They own more machines than they could ever work, so they hire people to work for them. And what's the interest of this factory owner? Well, they want the workers to produce as much as possible and pay them as little as possible. Both of these keep the profits up. Of course, these interests can lead to exploitation, and they usually did. But for once, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that it didn't always work like that. Some factories treated their workers well and exploited them less. Unfortunately, these benevolent factories would be outcompeted by the cruel ones and destroyed. Of course, the factory workers had opposing interests to the capitalists. They wanted to work as little as possible and get as much of the money as possible. The issue was that the workers had no money to build their own factories, so they had to work on the conditions of the capitalists. Naturally, this is the dialectic of capitalist society. Factory owners and landlords on the one side and workers and peasants on the other. There are parties that try to mediate between these opposing interests. Social Democrats come to mind, but they're ultimately never able to solve the conflict between these two groups. As such, this conflict has been going on for about 2 centuries. Is there any way to resolve it? Well, leftists believe so. The capitalists cannot exist without the workers. Bosses depend on many employees to make enough money to pay for their own wages and the profit of the boss. The capitalists need workers. But do the workers need the capitalists? Well, the function of the capitalist is to provide their private property to the workers and to take out surplus value. But wait, what if we change property law and let the workers be their own bosses? Maybe using direct or representative democracy. Could that work? Well, yes. And if we did it, workers could spread their profit equally. A system in which the people who run the factories also own the factories and share profit equally, or using votes, would be called socialism. If you're an American, this may surprise you because the Republicans call everything left of Reagan a socialist, but by definition, by the word of Marx and socialists, socialism means worker and community control over the means of production, being factories. Look, even Google says I'm right about that. Now, you may wonder, if workers could so easily take over the businesses and remove bosses, why don't they? Well, social values for one thing. A lot of workers don't want to take away what they perceive to be someone else's, even if it is undeniably in their interest. But the other and more significant reason is the cops. If you try and take control, they will tear gas you. Now, we're in current year, capitalists everywhere, protected by the cops and politicians. So, what will come now? Well, we live in a dialectical system with 2 opposing classes, and there are only 2 ways this conflict can resolve. Either this severely flawed system we have right now stays in place until the end of time, or it resolves. As we established, workers don't need capitalists. So, the only way these conflicts can permanently end is by seizing the land and industry of the capitalists and collectively sharing it among everyone, effectively destroying the capitalist class. So, that is a hopeful look into the future. Socialism with no more capitalist class warfare. Of course, it's possible that socialism would remain a classless system forever, but most don't think that likely. Look back at history. Every time a system of class was destroyed, it was replaced by a new one. Primitive communism by slavery, slavery by feudalism, feudalism by capitalism, and capitalism by socialism. soon, I hope. So it is entirely possible that within the decades after socialism is established, some new classes will develop and the circle of class war continues. What would a class war in socialism look like? No idea. We likely couldn't imagine it. When they established capitalism in an agrarian economy, they had no idea that the Industrial Revolution was going to undermine all freedom the market used to bring. So we can't know what conflict will come. Feel free to give me your suggestions in the comments though, and while you're at it, subscribe and leave a like. If you want to see more content, make sure to check out my stream channel Vicky2000, where I usually go live 2 times a week. Thank you for watching, thanks to those who donated, and especially Theon Hartley, Potato God 777, Darius the Bird, Eric Betts, Harris Hawk, V, Xander Corvus, Attila Nemet, Carissa, Daniel Hyman, Dominic Corzelli, DSM5 is better than ICD-10, Emily Marigold Claassen, Evie Wren, Hannah Rickett, Herdina, Josh C, Clastrup, Liam S, Lilith Craft, Mamuka Tsiliuari, Marxism Tonight, Nana Epema, Pote, Raymond DeVille, Red Shock Trooper, Sean Murphy, Stem Master Chef, Taylor CH, Trey, and Worshipper of the Olympians.